Christmas Eve in New Hampshire was supposed to be serene. Snow fell softly against my car's windshield as I drove down the winding back roads toward my parents' house. I had left Boston later than I planned. The office Christmas party had dragged on longer than expected. By the time I hit the highway, it was nearly 9 p.m., and my GPS told me I'd arrive a little after 11. I wasn't too worried. These roads were familiar. I'd driven them countless times visiting my parents. Tonight, though, something felt different. The radio hummed with Christmas classics, but the barren, snow-blanketed fields outside seemed unusually desolate. Only the faint outlines of skeletal trees broke the monotony of white. About an hour into the drive, my fuel gauge blinked, startling me. I realized I hadn't filled up in Boston and wouldn't make it to my parents' house without stopping. Cursing my oversight, I glanced at my GPS, searching for a gas station nearby. The closest one was 10 miles away, a tiny dot labeled Tom's Pump and Go. It wasn't ideal. Small, rural stations often closed early on holidays, but I had no choice. The road to Tom's was narrower and even more deserted. The snow was picking up, making it harder to see. After another mile, my headlights illuminated a dimly lit sign swinging from a rusted pole. Tom's Pump and Go, it read in faded letters. A single pump stood under a flickering light next to a squat, windowless building. The whole scene looked abandoned. I pulled in, parking next to the pump. A light was on inside the building, so I assumed it was open. The door creaked loudly as I stepped inside. The interior was cramped, cluttered with dusty snacks and outdated road maps. Behind the counter sat a wiry man in his late 50s, his thinning hair plastered to his scalp. He looked up from a newspaper, his pale blue eyes fixing on me. "Help you?" he asked in a flat tone. "Just need to fill up," I replied, pulling out my wallet. "Pump's prepaid. How much you want?" $40 should do it." He nodded, rang me up, and handed me a receipt without another word. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A small pile of wrapped Christmas gifts stacked in the corner, all marked with the same name, Evan. "Nice gifts," I said, trying to make small talk. "Big family." The man's expression hardened. "None of your business," he muttered. I decided not to push it. Outside, the snow had thickened into a blizzard. I hurried to the pump, shivering as I filled the tank. The whole place felt unnervingly still. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the howling wind, a muffled scream. I froze, my hand gripping the nozzle. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the back of the building. Logic told me to get back in my car and drive away, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept around the side of the building, where a narrow path led to a darkened rear door. The muffled cries were more distinct now, a woman's voice, pleading. "Please don't." My heart raced. I reached for my phone, but I had no signal. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw a narrow staircase descending into the basement. The cries were louder now, mixed with low, menacing murmurs. "Shut up," a male voice growled. "Nobody's coming for you." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away. I crept down the stairs, wincing as each step creaked under my weight. At the bottom was a small, dimly lit room. A woman in her 20s was tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. A burly man stood over her, his back to me. "You think someone's gonna miss you?" he snarled. I didn't think, I acted. Grabbing a rusty wrench from a nearby workbench, I swung it as hard as I could at the man's head. The impact sent him sprawling, and the woman let out a muffled scream. I grabbed her chair, dragging it toward the stairs. "Who are you?" she gasped as I untied her. "Just passing through," I muttered. "Can you walk?" She nodded shakily, and I helped her up the stairs. The man groaned behind us, stirring. "Go," I urged, pushing her toward the exit. We stumbled outside into the blizzard, my car barely visible through the snow. The woman was barefoot, her thin dress offering little protection from the cold. I shoved her into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel, peeling out of the lot just as the man burst through the door, a shotgun in his hands. The car fishtailed on the icy road, but I managed to regain control. I drove for miles without stopping, my hands trembling on the wheel. The woman sat silently, staring at the dashboard. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." We reached the next town, where I pulled into a well-lit diner and called the police. By the time officers arrived, the woman had told me her story. She'd been abducted from a nearby rest stop earlier that evening. The man and his accomplice, the wiry clerk, had planned to kill her after their fun. The police arrested both men later that night. They found evidence linking them to several unsolved disappearances in the area. I spent Christmas morning at the police station, giving statements and trying to process what had happened. That night, when I finally made it to my parents' house, the warmth of their hugs felt more comforting than ever before. But even now, years later, every Christmas Eve, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of that silent, sinister night. I was alone on Christmas Eve. The storm outside had turned everything into a blur of white. It was the kind of night where the silence feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. The wind howled against the windows, but inside, everything was still and quiet. The air was thick with the smell of the holiday dinner I had just finished preparing for myself. It wasn't much, a simple meal just enough for one. A sad attempt to make the night feel festive. The table was set for one, the candles flickering in the dim light, casting long shadows on the walls. The tree, half lit by the lights I'd strung on it, seemed to tremble with each gust of wind. I had just finished setting everything down when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I froze for a moment, heart pounding. Who could be out there in this weather? I didn't recognize the sound, and it didn't make sense. Why would anyone be visiting on Christmas Eve, especially in the middle of a storm? When I opened the door, there was nothing but a small package resting on the welcome mat. No return address, no delivery note. Just the plain brown paper wrapped tightly around it, sealed with a red ribbon that was beginning to fray at the edges. My first thought was maybe it was a mistake. Someone had left it at the wrong house. But it didn't feel like a mistake. I picked it up and brought it inside, a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine. I set the package down on the kitchen table, and as I did, I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell, almost like perfume. It was subtle, barely there, but it clung to the air in the room. It was odd, out of place for a Christmas Eve in the middle of a storm. I hesitated, standing there for a long moment before carefully unwrapping it. I almost wanted to leave it alone, but something pushed me forward. My hands trembled as I pulled the brown paper apart. Inside, there was a blood-stained sweater. My heart slammed against my chest. I didn't know who it belonged to or how it got there, but the blood looked real. Too real. The fabric was soaked, and the color, bright red, stared up at me like some horrible mark. The smell was stronger now, sickeningly sweet, like iron, filling my nostrils. I had to swallow hard to keep my stomach from turning. Along with the sweater, there was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting that looked frantic, almost angry. "This was for you. Merry Christmas." A cold chill swept through the room. It was as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I felt nauseous, and my hands shook as I dropped the note and the sweater onto the table. My mind raced. Was this some sick joke? A prank? Or was this real? The letter didn't make sense. Why would someone send me this? Who would do such a thing, especially on Christmas Eve? Was I being watched? Had someone broken into my house, left the package, and slipped away unnoticed? I didn't know who to call first, but I had to report it. I called the police, feeling a sense of urgency, but when I told them what had happened, they didn't seem to take me seriously. They said they'd send someone out to check, but it would take a while. I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, that the police would handle it, but doubt gnawed at me. The police arrived hours later, after the storm had calmed. They took the package, the sweater, and the note, promising to investigate. Their presence was reassuring, but there was still something unsettling in the air. They asked if I knew anyone who might be playing a prank on me, but I couldn't think of anyone. No one I knew would do something like that. The next morning, I followed up with the police. They told me that the items had been analyzed. The blood on the sweater was confirmed to be human blood, but it didn't match anyone in their system. The blood was fresh, indicating it had been spilled recently, but there were no signs of a crime scene. The package and the note were still in their possession, and there were no signs of tampering. The police explained that they were continuing their investigation, but they didn't have any leads. They advised me to keep an eye out and to report anything unusual. The words felt hollow as they left my house. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I kept wondering who could have left that package and why. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind, trying to piece together something, anything, that could explain what had happened. Even though the police were involved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who truly understood how dangerous this was. The police had done what they could, but I felt like I was on my own with this. It was Christmas Eve and the neighborhood was quiet. Most people were either at church services or spending time with their families. I had just returned from a holiday dinner at my parents' house and was looking forward to a peaceful evening at home. The snow was falling gently, and my small suburban street looked like something out of a postcard. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my living room, watching the twinkling lights of my Christmas tree. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a notification from my home security app. The motion detector had picked up movement in my driveway. Thinking it was just a deer or maybe a neighbor cutting through my yard, I opened the app to check the camera feed. My stomach tightened when I saw a man standing near my car, peering inside with a flashlight. He was bundled in a thick jacket, his face partially hidden by a scarf and hood. I tapped the microphone on the app and spoke loudly. "Can I help you?" The man froze, turned off the flashlight, and walked out of view. I waited a few moments, watching the screen. He didn't return, so I told myself it was just someone looking for something to steal and that I had scared him off. Still, I locked all the doors and windows just in case. A half hour passed. I had started to relax again when there was a loud crash from the back of the house. My heart stopped. I grabbed my phone and rushed to the kitchen, where I found the glass from the back door shattered. The cold night air was rushing in, and there were footprints in the snow leading inside. Panicking, I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator that someone had broken into my house. She told me to find a safe place to hide and to stay on the line. I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. The operator was calm, but I could hear the tension in her voice as she assured me that police were on their way. She asked if I could still hear anything. I strained to listen and heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house. "Stay quiet," she said. "The officers are less than 5 minutes away." The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then the knob turned, and the door rattled against the lock. "Police are on their way," I screamed, hoping to scare him off. Instead of leaving, he began slamming his weight against the door. The wood creaked, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I gripped the bat tighter, ready to swing the moment he broke through. Suddenly, I heard shouting from outside, the distinct, commanding voices of the police. The man cursed loudly and ran. I stayed in my room until the officers announced themselves. When I finally opened the door, they were standing in my living room, weapons drawn, and the intruder was gone. They found him a few blocks away, hiding in an abandoned shed. He was carrying a knife in his backpack. The officers said I was lucky to have called when I did. That Christmas, I learned how quickly the comfort of home can shatter, and how close danger can be, even on the most silent of nights. Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. The streets sparkled with lights, the houses were decorated with wreaths, and everything seemed peaceful under the soft blanket of snow. That year, though, my plans to spend the evening by the fire with my family were derailed by a last-minute shift at the 24-hour diner where I worked. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight, and I was eager to get home. The roads were nearly deserted as I drove through the snowy countryside. The hum of my car heater was the only sound, and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers was almost hypnotic. I was halfway home when I spotted him. A man was standing on the shoulder of the road, waving both arms to flag me down. He was bundled in a worn jacket, and a duffel bag lay at his feet. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening with hesitation. My parents had always warned me about picking up strangers, especially at night. But it was Christmas Eve, and I couldn't bring myself to drive past. I pulled over and cracked the window. "Are you okay?" "Car broke down about a mile back," he said, his voice rough. "I just need a lift to the nearest gas station." His breath came out in clouds, and he rubbed his hands together to keep warm. He didn't look particularly threatening, just tired and cold. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "Hop in," I said. "Thanks," he muttered, grabbing his bag and sliding into the passenger seat. As I started driving again, I couldn't help but notice his fidgeting. He clutched the duffel bag tightly, his hands trembling slightly. Whether it was from the cold or something else, I couldn't tell. "Heading home for Christmas?" I asked, hoping to break the awkward silence. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat. "Long day. You?" "Same," I replied. "Worked a late shift at the diner. Just glad to be heading back now." He nodded but didn't say anything more. The silence between us grew heavy. "How far is the gas station?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Not far," he said, his gaze fixed out the window. But something in his tone made my pulse quicken. As we passed a lit intersection, I considered pulling over at the brightly lit convenience store up ahead, but he spoke before I could. "That's not the right way," he said sharply. I froze. "What do you mean?" "The gas station's further up. Keep going." My stomach churned. The road ahead was darker and emptier than I remembered. I thought about making an excuse to stop, but his hand rested on the duffel bag, and my mind raced with possibilities. "Do you mind if I warm up my hands?" he asked, pulling off his gloves. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. When he flexed his fingers, I saw that his knuckles were bruised, as though he'd been in a fight. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the road. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour. I tried to think of a plan. Finally, I said, "You know what? I just remembered I need to stop by my friend's place. It's right up here. Shouldn't take long." He didn't respond. His eyes narrowed, and he shifted in his seat. I turned onto a side street leading to a small, well-lit neighborhood. The houses here were close together, and Christmas lights glowed in nearly every window. I spotted one with a car in the driveway and a porch light on. "This is it," I said, pulling into the driveway and throwing the car into park. He didn't move. His grip on the duffel bag tightened. "You're not taking me to the gas station?" "I'll just be a minute," I said, fumbling with the door handle. Before he could say another word, I jumped out of the car and hurried to the porch, pretending to know the people inside. I knocked loudly, my heart pounding. The man didn't follow me. Instead, he got out of the car, adjusted his bag, and walked down the street without a word. I watched him until he disappeared around a corner, then turned back to the house. The door opened, and a startled woman peered out. I quickly explained what had happened, and she let me use her phone to call the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of him. They also checked the stretch of road where he claimed his car had broken down. There was nothing. I drove home that night with the unsettling realization that I'd avoided something terrible, though I'd never know exactly what. The memory of his scars, his bag, and his cold, calculating demeanor still haunts me every Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve had always been a quiet, family-only affair for us. This year was no different. My parents, younger sister Sarah, and I were gathered around the dining table, the scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider filling the room. Snow fell in heavy flakes outside, blanketing the world in an eerie silence. The knock at the door came just as we were finishing dessert. Who could that be? Mom frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. We didn't expect anyone, especially not tonight. Dad went to answer, and when he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, along with a man in a worn parka and boots dusted with snow. His face was rough, his beard patchy, and his eyes darted nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaking. "My car broke down a few miles back. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for a tow." Dad hesitated, but my mom, ever the compassionate one, ushered him inside. "Of course, you must be freezing." The man stepped in, stamping the snow off his boots. "Thank you. It's so hard finding a house out here. Most places are dark. You've got a lovely family." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Dad handed him the cordless phone, and we returned to the dining table, trying to act natural. I couldn't help but glance at him as he made the call, or at least pretended to. "I'll just wait outside," he said after a minute, handing the phone back to Dad. "Tow company said it'd take about an hour." No, Mom insisted. "You'll wait here where it's warm. Let me fix you a plate." He protested weakly but eventually sat at the table with us. Something about him unsettled me. His hands trembled as he ate, and his eyes lingered a little too long on Sarah, who was only 15. "What were you doing out here so late?" Dad asked, his tone polite but guarded. "I was heading to my sister's," the man replied, his fork hovering over the plate. "She lives just past the state line. Wanted to surprise her." Dad nodded, but I saw his jaw tighten. The nearest state line was 2 hours away. As the minutes dragged on, the man's behavior grew stranger. He asked us where we worked, how long we'd lived here, and if we had neighbors close by. Mom tried to steer the conversation back to Christmas traditions, but his questions felt invasive. When the hour passed and no tow truck arrived, Dad offered to call again. "Let me check the number," he said, reaching for the phone. The man stiffened. "No need. They're probably just running late." Dad's eyes narrowed. "I'll call anyway." "No!" The man's voice rose sharply, and we all froze. He realized his mistake and forced a laugh. "I mean, it's Christmas Eve. They're probably swamped. I'll give it a few more minutes." Dad didn't press, but I saw him glance toward the hall where he kept his hunting rifle. The atmosphere grew tense. The man barely touched the second plate Mom served him. He kept shifting in his seat, his fingers tapping against the table. "I think I'll step outside for a smoke," he finally said, standing abruptly. "You don't have to." Mom started, but Dad cut her off. "Let him," he said, his tone firm. The man grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. Dad followed, locking the door behind him. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," I said, my stomach twisting. But something's not right. Through the window, I watched as the man paced the porch, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. He glanced at the driveway, then the woods, then back at the house. Dad didn't let him back in. He stood by the door, arms crossed, and after a few tense minutes, the man left, trudging down the snowy road. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Dad drove to the nearest gas station to ask about the tow company. The attendant frowned when Dad described the man. "No one called for a tow last night," he said. "Haven't seen anyone walking in from that direction either." Unease crept over us as we pieced things together. The man had lied about the call, and his behavior now seemed more sinister in hindsight. Later that afternoon, Dad checked the front porch and found fresh cigarette butts scattered around. More than he could have smoked in the few minutes he stood outside. It was as if he'd been there much longer than we realized, watching us. For days after, we double-checked the locks on every door and window. Dad even installed a new deadbolt on the front door. The man never came back, but for the rest of that winter, every knock at the door sent a chill down my spine.